Hey guys, what is up? It's Poe back with another video, and today this is the, I think, fourth installment in the guide going over everything you know about Shadow Priest for the opening patch of Shadowlands. So, today's video we're going over Castle Nathria specifically. I'm going to go boss by boss of my talent suggestions, any tips I have for that boss, and things like legendaries, things like that. If you haven't seen, there's 3 other parts out right now, more coming in the future about, you know, your rotation, talents, whatever else. So, check that link in the description if you want to know more. And also, before I get started here again, a lot of this information is also in my written guide on icyveins.com, which is also linked in the description, so feel free to use that as kind of like, you know, your cheat sheet or something to look at while you're in the middle of raid to get that kind of quick glimpse of what you want to do. All right, without further ado, let's get started. Okay, so before I get into kind of the specific tips on a boss-by-boss basis, I do want to kind of cover some generic things for Castle Nathria. So for this 10-boss raid, there's actually some generic stuff that you can kind of do to get yourself ready. If you didn't already watch the talent video, I did kind of go over a composite raid build. This talent build that you're seeing over here on the right will basically get you by for, you know, everything that you're doing for the most part. There are some of these talents that are kind of optional, or you can maybe switch up if you want a bit easier of a time, but this build will get you through most of the bosses in a good fashion. We're only switching certain talents on a few select bosses. Kind of depends on what you're looking for and what your group needs, so keep that in mind. Now, as far as legendaries go, I wanted to bring this up specifically just because there's not a whole lot of choice in terms of our legendaries and more or less the strength of our legendaries. But I do want to call it out that we basically have 3 choices that you want to kind of keep in mind, or even have a crafted version of all 3 of these depending on what you're doing. So the first one up is Eternal Call of the Void. This is the one that we've all been suggesting everyone craft first. It is the most versatile legendary, although its consistency is kind of up in the air, especially at lower haste values. But once you get to those higher haste percentages of like 20, 25, or even 30%, you're going to get a bit more consistency out of this legendary. It is RPPM. It does scale with haste, so more haste equals generally more procs. That being said, a lot of you guys that have already crafted it might have noticed it's not always as consistent as you would maybe like it to be. Or maybe on certain fights where we're, you know, heavily multi-dotting, we're not casting Mind Flayer, Mind Seer as frequently. You're like, hey, I'm not getting a whole lot of use out of this guy. Don't be too discouraged. It does look a little funny on the damage meter, I know, but that's mostly because the big value of this legendary is coming from the insanity value, not the value on the damage meter. So getting extra insanity equals more devouring plague, so it's hard to really just look at like, hey, the Mind Flayer Tentacle only did, you know, 2-3% of my damage. Like, that's not that great. In the grand scheme of things, the insanity is the bigger part of that, making sure you get the insanity at the right time in the fight. So that being said, if you want to use something different, there are a few fights where you could do that. Our other 2 options of legendaries to really consider, I think, are Talbadar's Stratagem and Twins of the Sun Priestess. There's also Norganons if you really struggle with movement, but I'm going to mainly focus on Talbadar's and Twins here. Now, Talbadar's is basically just a pure single target legendary. It does not affect what you're doing here. Like, it doesn't make you want to use the Mind Devourer Conduit. It also doesn't make you want to take Psychic Link. It doesn't change up your build that significantly. Those 2 options are both worse off than the other things. But that being said, Talbadar's is just blanket extra Mind Blast damage, which can be helpful on pure single target bosses when we are keeping up Devouring Plague a lot. Anytime we're adding multi-target fights, the amount of uptime we're getting on Devouring Plague on our main target will go down quite substantially relative to the other things that we're doing. And you're going to kind of want to use that Mind Flay, or Mind Blast rather, for the insanity rather than just pumping damage. So, that being said, if you do want to try out Talbadar's, there are a couple fights you could try using it on, mainly ShriekWing, Artificer, and Hungering Destroyer. These are 3, again, mainly just pure single target bosses. And if you're kind of struggling with Eternal Call of the Void on these fights, or you're trying to parse really effectively, you could try this out, and maybe better for progression more than parsing. Because again, Eternal Call of the Void on single target is still very, very strong. You just have to be able to get the proc when you want it. Sometimes that requires casting Mind Flay a little bit better than maybe you're used to. So keep that in mind. Generally speaking, Sludgefist is kind of the weird one with Talbadar's. Like, maybe it's worth, maybe it's not. I actually find myself able to game the Eternal Call of the Void pretty easily on that fight because you're kind of banking up insanity for his vulnerability phases anyway. And while you're doing that, you could be channeling Mind Flays to kind of gain out an extra proc or so right before that Devuln phase. So I actually get pretty good results with it on there. But again, if you want something more consistent for progression, that could be a good option. Now, that being said, I think something that actually might even trump everything I just said about Talbadar's as that kind of second option is Twins of the Sun Priestess. So this legendary is a raid DPS increase. It is not a DPS increase for you specifically. All it is if you cast Power Infusion on someone else, you also get it. So I've done sims to kind of say like, okay, hey, if we use Power Infusion the times that we want power infusion on someone else, who should we give it to? The results aren't too surprising. It's mostly just, your unholy DKs, your marksmanship hunters, things like that. Even Red Paladin, actually, again, it's pretty solid with that as well, especially considering if, depending on your covenant, you're sinking things on a 2-minute or 3-minute basis. This is also a competitive legendary. Really, the only fight that really shines for me on this is Kael'thas and the Blood Prince fight. Blood Prince, whatever it's called, I forget. The one with all the crazy ads and everything. Sun King, that's what it is. This fight's just kind of wonky, and there's not really a whole lot of time for us to be casting Mind Flay, or even Mind Blast for that matter, unless you're talking about just specific boss damage. From an overall perspective, running Twins here could be better, but again, it really just depends on your group and who you're giving Power Infusion to. I think for most use cases, Twins is going to be a either slight loss or pretty equal to Eternal Call of the Void, especially if you're talking about like equal gearing and equal skill. But again, that's going to vary from player to player and from raid group to raid group. But having, I think, all three of these options in your toolkit will be pretty good for the raid. Okay, so moving on, a couple things I want to talk about before I get into like my specific suggestions are talent choices. So the first one is Auspicious Spirits or Shadow Crash. For the most part, you can basically use either one of these somewhat interchangeably, especially on single target. As we get into AoE, especially if it's stacked, you're going to see Shadow Crash start to shine. But outside of that, guys, even on single target, the difference of these guys is going to be very, very small, especially if you already have your second conduit with Hunting Apparitions. That's going to basically, put AS over the edge of Shadow Crash there. Now, the big thing here is, and the reason why I think you're going to see a lot of people, including myself, taking Auspicious Spirits most of the time, is that if you miss a single Shadow Crash, it probably wasn't worth to take the talent. Which, if the boss is moving or teleporting, the tanks are repositioning, you're moving for a mechanic or whatever else that is, right? That's actually kind of a high chance that you could miss that. It is a ground targeted ability. So because of that, I think especially for newer players, or if you're just learning on a fight, AS is going to win there for most of the stuff. But again, for the most part, these guys are interchangeable. The last thing I want to bring up is Misery versus Twist of Fate. So these are both kind of, I guess I want to say mad talents. They're not going to affect your damage too much. Misery is significantly easier to play with, no doubt. It's basically just you keep up your 2 dots on every target, more or less. Twisted Fate is generally the more skilled option, and if you can pull it off successfully, will almost always net better results than Misery. The question really becomes, how many targets are you dotting? How frequently are you dotting them? Because Misery is just there to save you globals for dotting. That is if you actually do want to double dot these targets. And Twist of Fate can still be really great on even 2 or 3 target fights to get that extra execute uptime, even if the boss isn't an execute, but an add is instead. So you're going to see for a lot of these guys, I'm going to recommend Twist of Fate. But just know if you're struggling on a fight, Misery is not that much further behind. You're talking about a 1%, upwards of 2% at most loss. And again, that will change up depending on how many targets you're dotting. So keep that in mind. All right, so that is all the caveats out of the way. Let's get into each boss. All right, guys, first boss of Castle Nathria is Shriekwing. Not a whole lot to say here. This is one of the kind of pure single target fights. There's not a whole lot going on here. For the most part, optimizing this fight is going to be all about trying to not move as much as possible to kind of plant your feet, cast those mind flays, all that good stuff, and make sure you're not dying to mechanics and that sort of thing. So big things here. I do want to mention that you want to be tracking his phase timings, right? Depending on when you're popping your cooldowns, you're going to get your like Void Eruption very close to when he's phasing. Make sure you don't pop that Void Eruption, because when he is in that phase transition, he doesn't take any damage. So you want to hold your cooldown if you get to that point. So be very, very careful about that. Night Phase are going to have an especially probably weird time with this fight, but if you can manage it well, you're going to get some great results to get Void Eruption very consistently on that fight. The other big thing here, if you get a mechanic where you do have to move out, make sure you're using your globals effectively to move here. Again, it's a single target fight. The only thing that's going to hurt you here is that movement. So make sure you're using, Shadow Word Death, Shadow Word Pain to help you move effectively. You don't really want to use Dark Thought procs on the move as something to cast, but, if you do it, it's not the end of the world. Again, Shadow Word Death and Shadow Word Pain are usually what you want to do there. Now, that being said, other things I want to call out here are things with our talents. So generally speaking, this is our single target build, kind of set it and forget it. You're going to use this for the first couple bosses. So for the most part, Fortress of the Mind, Twist of Fate, here are the big ones. Auspicious Spirits or Shadow Crash here. Again, I prefer Auspicious Spirits here, especially if I had to move out for a mechanic and like the boss is at a weird position, or maybe it gets moved. Like I could miss that Shadow Crash. It's kind of annoying. And again, line of sight mechanics are always kind of weird with that, so I prefer AS. But again, either one will work just fine. I also like Void Torrent here, definitely the single target option, and then of course Hungering Void on that last row. The other thing I do want to say here is when he is transitioning, just a little quick tip here, he actually teleports to the middle of the room and then does this big cast. He's actually not immune until that cast finishes, which for me, based on my fight timings, almost always lines up with another Void Torrent cast and another Mind Games cast before he goes into transition. So you can do that. Don't worry too much about getting dots up before he phases, because again, he is immune during that phase. You're basically just going to be sitting in that intermission phase trying to get up as much sanity as possible for when he comes back. But that is Shriekwing. Alright guys, let's talk about the next boss, which is going to be Huntsman Altimor. So for the most part, this boss is actually basically your single target boss again, but now it has an add as well. The great part about this from a multi-dotter's perspective is that the add and the boss do share health. So there isn't really any kind of effective padding as long as you're hitting both dogs, or both the dog and the boss at all times. So for the most part, you want to keep up your 2 main dots on both targets at all times, and then funnel in on one of the targets. This is actually pretty important, especially with Hungering Void specifically. You know, if you're using Hungering Void, you get that debuff on the target. It can only be on one target at a time. So whatever target that is generally the one that you want to dump your Devouring Plagues into, especially while you're inside of Void form. Just because otherwise you're kind of wasting that kind of extra 10% damage, even though you are gaining more mastery uptime on that other dog. It's better to funnel in on that target with Hungering Void, so make sure you do that. Now, the other thing too, I do want to mention, this is kind of funny, a lot of people were using Psychic Link on this boss kind of very early on into the tier. There was a bug with that talent that's since been fixed. Do not use Psychic Link, it is not worth it. Auspicious Spirits is infinitely better on that fight. Don't worry about it. I know it looks a little like it should be good, but it's not, unfortunately, so there you go. Other thing I do want to kind of mention is with the Shades of Barghast. So I think it's like phase 2, the second dog that comes out, he's going to spawn Shades of himself. And at some point, they're going to get like, I don't know, like 18 stacks or so. And then you're going to either grip them in or kill both of the ads. You want to kind of pay attention to the stacks that these guys' ads have and coordinate with like your rate of when you're breaking them. Because, you know, once you guys have decided to pop them, they need to die quickly. Otherwise, you could risk blowing up the raid. So because of that, you do want to kind of save some cooldowns. So, you know, if you have Shadow Crash or whatever you're talented into on that row, maybe a Void Torrent, maybe save up a Devouring Plague or two to make sure you can burst those ads as effectively and quickly as possible. Just to make sure they die. It's not gonna, don't worry about, you know, it's not a padding thing to do. The ad does need to die, and the pad damage gets scrubbed anyways, so don't worry about that. There's no cheese with that at all. Again, I don't know if I would say Void Form for killing them. That kind of depends on your group. For the most part, you can use these guys on cooldown. Don't worry about that too much. Just make sure you're keeping in mind in fight timing, like always. That's the big thing with this raid tier, especially with our new cooldown design. You only want to save your cooldowns if it's your last one of the fight, then you can sync them up. Otherwise, you're good to go. Now, again, the talent build here that I'm going to put up is very similar to what we had before. The one thing I do want to call out with this build is actually Psychic Horror. So, with those Shades of Barghast, we can actually do a little bit of CC on them. The main things that we can do, or not very many, is Psychic Scream, Psychic Horror, and Mind Bomb. Obviously, I would not suggest talenting into Mind Bomb, but with Psychic Horror, you can get that single target stun and still have your fear to kind of, you know, it's like your oh crap button if anything goes wrong with the raid. Otherwise, you know, the main CCs are the ones you're going to want to use, like Polymorph or others, right? Another thing I do want to mention here, Twist of Fate is what you want to pick here. I know Misery might look a little tempting since it is a 2-target fight, but keeping up dots on 2 targets really isn't that difficult. And with Twist of Fate, you're getting like 50-60% uptime because of the ads constantly phasing and changing health. So pulling off Twist of Fate here is going to get you a big pool of great results, so make sure you're doing that. And that, guys, that is Huntsman Altimor. Let's move on to Hungering Destroyer. Alright guys, moving on to Hungering Destroyer. Not too much to say here. Again, it's a pretty straightforward fight. Again, the same kind of single target build for this boss as well. The only thing I do want to call out here that is kind of interesting, if you are a Venthyr, which I am, Mind Games does actually get extra DPS on this fight. So if you're a Venthyr, you're going to get some better damage, probably than any other Covenant ability that you're going to find in this fight. Since he's constantly doing kind of leech healing from the tanks here, you're getting that damage reversal as well, or the healing reversal that converts into damage onto the boss. So you're gonna get some pretty saucy Mind Games on this fight, as long as you're just using it on cooldown with the mastery as you normally would, right? Which is kind of fun. Now, the only thing I will also say is you want to keep in mind the consume timings for this fight, which is that big kind of pull-in mechanic that the boss does. Be careful about using your cooldowns and when that's about to happen. This has definitely burned me a few times where I started using, you know, Void Torrent or Void Eruption even, and then he does the consume and I have to immediately run out, maybe even out of range of the boss, depending on if we're on Mythic or not. So Just make sure you be aware of the fight timings. You don't want to munch a cooldown because there's a mechanic about to interrupt you there. So make sure you're keeping that in mind. Otherwise, guys, again, be very cautious about your movements. Make sure you're planning them with those instant cast effects while you're moving out for either handling the orbs or whatever else it is. Because, again, movement's the big thing here. If you can move effectively, use your cooldowns effectively, you're going to do great on this boss. All right, let's move on. All right, now we have Artificer Xy'mox. This is kind of the teleport or the portal boss. Again, a very simple talent setup here, same as all the other bosses that we were just looking at. Single target, nothing else is going to change here with that. Now, the big thing here, again, you want to make sure you're watching your boss timers here. This is the big important thing. If you know that the ghosts are coming out soon or the portals are coming out soon, I would caution maybe using your big stuff, because the last thing you want to do is have to pop all your cooldowns, then get a mechanic that requires you to move out of range of the boss. So it's better here to be a little cautious, especially on progression when you're not, just trying to hunt for that parse, because the last thing you want is to lose out on all that damage of our cooldown. Now, this is more important, I think, on his Edge of Annihilation ability when he's doing, again, that suck-in mechanic. I would definitely hold your cooldowns there. You're probably going to be focused on, using your body and soul procs for dispersion to make sure you're moving effectively, and you're not going to be worried about damaging as much, especially on progression. So make sure you're keeping that in mind there, because otherwise it could really burn you on this boss. Otherwise, guys, again, it's just pure single target, nothing really crazy here. If your group is kind of struggling or still progressing, they might trigger some traps, which can be good for Twist of Fate uptime if you're running that talent, which I do suggest that you do. So especially if someone's breaking traps early on and not immuning out of it, that could actually be a solid DPS increase. So traps aren't always the end of the world for your damage, but you do want to make sure you break these guys out as soon as possible, because it will probably kill them if they don't otherwise. So otherwise, that is Artificer Xy'mox. Let's move on to the next boss. All right, guys, next up, let's talk about Sun King Salvation, or the Kael'thas encounter. So this guy is going to be our worst fight in the raid, so don't feel too bad if your DPS looks a little weak compared to others. You have a few choices here on how you want to build that will change up what you're doing. So the first kind of set is you can go full pad. If you're trying to parse, you can do that. Or you could also just build for the Kael'thas part of the fight specifically, get that boss damage out. This is, I tend to lean towards group number 2 if we're like on a progression type encounter, because especially getting that big priority target damage can be good for the soul infusers and as well as Kael'thas themselves, and you kind of let everyone else handle the kind of group wide AoE. So depending on your group composition, you can kind of change up what you do here, which is why the talent choices are going to look a little bit more different than usual, for sure. I would say the one thing I would caution against, you're going to see a few people taking Searing Nightmare in the kind of top parses. Again, this is if you're really just trying to pad. Searing Nightmare is going to be pretty terrible on the parts of the fight where you really want the damage. And again, depending on your group composition, if everyone else is also blasting AoE, you're going to get bad results with Searing Nightmare. You kind of have to let people let you pad instead of them. So I would caution against that guy for the most part. I think Misery is the safer pick overall for kind of full fight damage. Now, that being said as well, I think Death and Madness is the clear winner here. Getting these couple deaths off throughout the fight is going to give you a big chunk of insanity to kind of spread your Devouring Plagues on lots of different mobs throughout the fight, which feels really, really great. Now, other talents to think about, I generally always like Shadow Crash here. You're getting several clumps of stacked adds here, which feels great, and it's still competitive on single target, which is nice. AS, the travel time of those spirits is really going to screw you up a little bit, so generally speaking, Shadow Crash makes sense. Now, again, this is where one of those hybrid decisions come into place. I prefer Void Torrent for that level 45 row here. You could take Mindbender if you, again, want that kind of stacked pad damage, but I think Void Torrent makes more sense for the priority target damage on Kael'thas, especially on progression. And then the last row here, Hungering Void or Surrender to Madness could be used. Just be a little careful with Surrender here, because again, you're going to have a problem of some of these ads, like the Phoenix ads, don't actually die. So if you surrender them, you actually don't get it, which kind of stinks that you don't get that for the boss specifically. So again, I think for the most part, Hungering Void is the kind of safer pick. And again, you'll get the priority target damage on Kael'thas himself. Now, you will also see some people taking Ancient Madness, which just feels really weird. Now, this is another fight I mentioned before. I would probably suggest not using Eternal Call of the Void here. Twins of the Sun Priestess is probably the legendary that I would pick here. You're not going to get a whole lot of great use out of Eternal Call of the Void here. You're either going to be proccing a Mind Seer Tentacle, and then all the ads die, and then you're your Mind Seer Tentacle is just single targeting something, it's going to get you really wonky results. I think Twins is probably the better choice here. Unfortunately, we don't have a great legendary for these kinds of cases, which is why, you know, Twins comes into play on this boss specifically. You know, you PI someone else, you'll get kill fast down quicker once you phase. Usually what I want to go with. But again, you know, whatever you want to go with here doesn't really matter. Just keep in mind, you know, I've had pulls of this where Eternal Call of the Void did like basically nothing. So keep that in mind. All right, let's move on to the next boss. All right, guys, one of the last kind of more straightforward fights of this instance is Lady Inerva Darkvein. We do have a couple ads coming on this fight, but even though we do have those ads, there's really not a whole lot to change up here. It's still going to be mostly about making sure you're kind of planting as much as possible and not, you know, moving all over the place. Like, be very cautious about your movements. You know, use those globals effectively to either soak things or move out of the way for orbs, whatever you got to do. Now, that being said, since this is an ad encounter, you do have a couple more options of what you want to build. I would still suggest you guys take Twist of Fate here. Misery is going to look like a popular choice, especially as you get into Heroic and Mythic with the amount of ads that are coming out. But I'm not quite convinced yet that the amount of ads that are coming out makes Misery that worth. I think it's still leaning over to Twist of Fate for kind of overall damage. But again, kind of take what you think makes sense based on your progression of the encounter. Doesn't really matter. I think Shadow Crash here could be very strong. The biggest problem I've had with Shadow Crash on this boss specifically is if people don't have the ads stacked, the ads actually do not move or hardly at all move. So getting them all stacked into that radius of Shadow Crash can be a little difficult here, which is why I think AS is the kind of safer, more consistent pick, because the last thing you want is, you know, someone gets an ad and then dies with it and it's out in the middle of nowhere and you just kind of messed up your Shadow Crash, right? Otherwise, you could also take Surrender to Madness apart from this kind of standard build. Surrender could make sense here. It was doing very good for me on Mythic for beta testing, but again, it's going to kind of depend on what you want for the fight. You're going to get pretty easy surrenders on those ads. They do almost always die within 25 seconds, so you're going to get a pretty easy surrender on them. But again, Hungering Void is going to give you that great priority target damage on the boss. So depending on what you're looking for between overall Void form uptime and specific priority target damage is kind of the choice on that boss specifically. Alright guys, that is it for Darkvein. Let's move on to the Council of Blood. Okay, so next up we have the Council of Blood boss. Now the interesting part about this fight is it does kind of change up what you're doing based on the order that you kill the bosses. So depending on what strategy you're taking, if it's like the default Mythic strat or maybe a different one, the order of the bosses will actually change how many ads that you're getting, how much movement that you personally have to do as a Shadow Priest. And so all these things will somewhat change what you're going to want to build as. Most of my recommendations here are kind of based on the Mythic fight timings, where you do get a lot of ads towards the end of the fight, including the big general ad. But if you don't get that, this might change a little bit, but for the most part, it's going to stay roughly the same. Now, because of that kind of strat, I do generally recommend taking Misery on Heroic and especially on Mythic. I think you're just going to get flooded with ads that you're saving so many globals throughout the fight, it's really going to start beating out Twist of Fate. Now, on normal or maybe heroic speed clears, Twist of Fate might come back into fold. Like, if the ads are just getting melted, maybe Twist of Fate makes more sense. Because, you know, if the ads are only living 5 seconds, double dotting them isn't going to give you that good. But sniping them for Twist of Fate uptime is solid. So, make that decision there based on where you're at in progression. Because that's going to be the big choice there. Now, you could run Fortress of the Mind here as kind of a good default for that priority target damage. I do want to also add in Death and Madness as an option here. Again, as you get into Heroic, if you're taking that same Mythic strat or the Mythic fight, there are so many little waiter ads that make it very easy to snipe Shadow or Deaths off of. Getting that extra Insanity reset from Death and Madness specifically is going to be great for funneling that Insanity back into a priority target. So that could be very, very strong if you're using that fight. So big question mark on that talent depending on your strategy there, but probably what you're going to use for Mythic. Now, I generally speaking want to give you guys the recommendation of using Auspicious Spirits here. And if you are taking Auspicious Spirits, you are supposed to be casting Vampiric Touch on the off bosses here. That is a actual priority target damage increase with Auspicious Spirits talented. Getting those extra procs to Insanity to funnel again Insanity into that main target is worth it. Now, it is not worth it to keep up Shadow Word Pain on those bosses. Of course, if you're using Misery, you know, you will be double dotting them. But don't feel like rushed to refresh those off bosses until Vampiric Touch is coming off, rather than just Shadow Word Pain specifically. Now, if you decide to go Shadow Crash for whatever reason, it could work, but usually it's going to be more pad damage and not the specific priority target damage you're looking for, which is why I think AS is generally speaking the talent to pick here. Now, level 45 row. Again, Void Torrent makes the most sense. Mindbender, you know, just doesn't compete with the priority target damage here. And, you know, yes, the AoE insanity or the insanity generation from Mindbender could be nice, but usually with bosses moving around that much, not something I'd recommend. And again, guys, Hungering Void I think makes the most sense on this boss. The priority target damage is so hard to beat here. Surrender to Madness could work depending on ad timings, but I think again that priority target damage is going to be hard to give up here on this boss. All right, that is Council of Blood. Let's move on to Sludgefist. Alright guys, next up we have Sludgefist. This is the kind of last single target boss left in the raid for the most part. And this fight is all about cooldown timings here. You're probably still going to use your kind of standard single target build for this boss. Now the one thing here, I actually might lean towards taking Shadow Crash more often than AS here, if you can make it work. Because he has vulnerability phases that happen roughly every 70 seconds, Shadow Crash can be very solid for that, whereas AS is kind of overall damage, but you can burst better with Shadow Crash for those vulnerability phases. So if you can get Shadow Crash to work, I would suggest doing that. Me personally, I do still kind of lean towards AS because my tank positioning is still seemingly a little bit off, and so it's harder for me to be consistent with my Shadow Crashes, but I feel like once we get that strat down specifically, it'll be better to use that. Now, I'm going to go over briefly the cooldown timings for this boss that I would suggest. Now, the thing you want to keep in mind here is this is going to vary very heavily based on when you guys are going to be lusting and how fast the boss is going to die. So these timings are specifically if you're going to lust on that last pillar. Some people are also saving lust for the first pillar instead to burn them down quicker. If you're going to do that, for the most part, things get a little bit simpler. You're basically just holding your cooldowns until that first pillar and then using them on cooldown, and they should be back up for the last pillar of the fight. That's basically what you want to go with on this boss. But again, you do want to keep in mind and work with your raid leader, figure out what strategy that you're using, and quickly write out when you want to do your cooldowns when. Generally speaking, your goal here is to use your cooldowns as often as possible, lining up with these vulnerability phases. So you can see here on the graphics that I have up, these are the rough timings that you're going to use for the fight. Now again, this does switch up a little bit based on your covenant. So if you're a Kyrian, you're kind of revolving around your 3-minute cooldowns and using everything at once. Whereas if you're a non-Kyrian, whether you're Nightfey, Necrolord, or Venthyr, you're using things a little bit differently to kind of line up. You have a big bulk of using everything, holding using a little bit, then everything, and really just lining up around having things for the last pillar with Bloodlust. And as long as you line up things effectively with those pillars, you guys are going to do fine for this boss. Just make sure you're not just using your cooldowns willy-nilly here. You want to make sure you're maximizing those destructive impacts as much as possible. So make sure you're watching those fight timers. That's going to be really important for this boss. Now, the other thing I do want to point out here, in addition to these timings, is also with your legendary choice here. If you decide to go with Eternal Call of the Void, and kind of regardless, actually, you do kind of want to bank up a little bit. So Sludgefist will actually give you a little bit of a timer, depending on what add-ons you're using, about when he's going to charge a pillar. Once he starts his charge, or maybe even a little bit before, you can actually start banking up Insanity to get, a double Devouring Plague out for after he actually phases into the impact, so you get as much damage in there as possible. You can also start Mind Flaying, just kind of Mind Flay spamming, and kind of don't worry about capping Insanity because you're just kind of farming for a proc of Eternal Call of the Void here. If you can do that effectively for each pillar, you're going to get some pretty solid damage out of doing that. And guys, outside of that, I don't really have anything else to say. It's going to be kind of a wonky fight to learn going forward, but as soon as you get your cooldown timings down, work with your raid leader. The timings here are more or less what you want. They do happen, again, like I said, around every 70 seconds or so, with the first one happening around like 55, 58 seconds. It's a little RNG on that first one, but generally speaking, it's kind of on a timer after that. Alright guys, and that is Sludgefist. Hopefully these graphics help you out. Remember, I will be keeping an updated kind of fight-by-fight basis of when you should use your cooldowns in the Icy Veins guide, so make sure you check that out if you want some more detail. Alright guys, so now we have the second to last boss with Stone Legion Generals. This is the wonkiest fight in the instance, and definitely the one that probably needs the least amount of optimization. There's really not a whole lot happening here, to be honest with you guys. For the most part, especially on normal heroic, this is mainly just a single target fight with a 2-target fight right at the end. So because of that, I pretty much build similar to how I do on Blood Council and things like that. So this is mostly your kind of single target build for the most part. As you get into Mythic, things do change up quite considerably, and that's where I would start thinking about, hey, should I use Shadow Crash here? Should I use Death and Madness? Or even Surrender to Madness based on when what strat that you're using, when you want to phase those ads, and all that good stuff. So depending on what you guys are doing and what your group needs, you can build a little bit differently based off of that. So that's what these choices are mainly looking at for. For those of you guys doing just normal and heroic, kind of stick to your typical single target build with Forges of the Mind, Twist of Fate, all that good stuff, and then moving into especially kind of heroic, maybe even mythic for sure, rolling Misery, maybe Shadow Crash, and even Surrender to Madness if you get good timings on those adds. The pushback will be really nice with Surrender as well, getting that Castfall moving in there. Now, the other thing I do want to keep in mind here is that when you guys do transition, you want to keep in mind that timer, because similar to other fights, guys, make sure you're not using your cooldown if they're about to phase, which happens at like 51% or so, because once they phase, they don't take any more damage. It's just the adds that you're fighting there. And generally speaking, especially on normal and heroic, I don't like to use my cooldowns in those intermission phases. The ad's just going to get melted, so make sure you're timing your cooldowns the way you want to on the actual boss. If you need the extra ad damage, work with your raid team to coordinate that cooldown, otherwise you're going to hold for that phase. Now, after you kill the ad, if you're kind of sitting there just having downtime with the boss, not taking any damage, you can of course use things like Soul Shape or Door of Shadows to help you get those orbs to phase the boss faster. But since our mobility isn't the greatest, I usually do not do that and kind of just stick around the boss. But if you're using Eternal Call to the Void, make sure you're not just spamming Mind Flay into a target that's like mostly invulnerable. Since it is actually proccing a damage event, you can proc Eternal Call to the Void when they're in that invulnerability phase, which is bad, of course, right? Like, it's just, it'll give you the insanity, but not the damage. You'll probably already be at capped insanity. So if you're just sitting there trying to build up insanity on an invulnerable boss, I would say just spam Vampiric Touch or maybe even weave in some Mind Blast instead of using Mind Flay or Mind Seer. That way you're still getting a chance at getting a proc right as soon as you guys phase, but you're not wasting that proc on a target that's immune. And guys, that's really it for the Stone Legion Generals. I don't have much to say here. I will probably do a more specific dedicated guide for this fight on Mythic once I get there, but for now this is what we have, so hopefully this helps. Alright guys, the last fight that we're going to talk about in this video is Sire Denathrius. He's going to end up this video with us. Now, for the most part, this fight has a lot going on. Each phase brings something a little bit unique to it. So I'd say for this and how you're going to build for it, it's going to depend greatly on what your group needs and what you want to optimize for. If you want to optimize to parse, it's going to be very different than progressing in the last two phases of the fight. I would argue that for the most part, the first phase of the encounter matters the least out of all of them. It's generally pretty easy. So you want to be very careful here. If you look at logs right now, you're going to see people that are padding with Searing Nightmare, Shadow Crash, that kind of stuff. But those two talents are usually not great for the last two phases, which is arguably the more important parts of the fight. So specifically, if we start out here with the talent build, I would generally speaking go mostly single target here with a few changes, mostly just being Twist of Fate to Misery. In the last couple of phases of the fight, there's lots of spread target adds, especially in phase 2 that you want to nuke down, and Misery can be very, very helpful for that, especially since they are kind of spread. Now, for that same kind of reason, you know, AS versus Shadow Crash here is going to be a little interesting to pick from. I think AS is likely going to be the better choice overall for phase 2 and phase 3 optimized damage. However, that being said, since Shadow Crash is not target capped, it's going to do some monster damage in phase 1. I was doing our most recent heroic clear just to kind of see what it does. It's been a while since I've done the boss's DPS. And even at the end of the fight, Shadow Crash was still my second highest ability with like 80% of its damage coming just from phase 1. So, and that's just on the ads right there off the top of the bat. So again, you could use that, but if you're just trying to get your kind of parse up there, but in terms of like progression on that boss, I don't think Shadow Crash makes sense unless you're really struggling in phase 1. Again, since phase 2 is kind of weird, you do have like at most like 4 targets stacked in phase 2, but there's still going to be a few kind of off targets that are not stacked with the group, making Shadow Crash kind of inferior for those phases specifically, especially as the bosses are teleporting around. Remoria, the sword ad in phase 2, and is also teleporting around. So getting that 2 target cleave isn't going to happen as easily as possible with Shadow Crash. And again, if you're missing Shadow Crashes, it's not going to be great in those last 2 phases. It's mostly just there for padding in phase 1. Now, other things to keep in mind here, you could also run Surrender to Madness if that's what you want. There's a lot of ads dying, especially in phase 1 and phase 2. You can easily snipe for that. The problem with Surrender to Madness on this boss specifically is that in phase 3, there's really nothing to do that on, which is why you're still going to probably see most people taking Hungering Void for that more than anything. So guys, this is really the big part of the fight. Now, the other thing I do want to mention here, if you are a Venthyr, you can actually get some Mind Games healing reversals here in phase 1. The boss does like a leech cast on the ads that he spawns in phase 1. So if you time the Mind Games cast with those ads spawning, you usually get a bit of extra damage for that phase 1 priority target stuff. But again, phase 1 usually isn't where you're having problems. It's usually inside of phase 2, but your main priority target is still going to be the boss guys. The faster you phase 2, the better it's going to be. So for the most part, depending on the strategy that you're going to run, you're probably just going to off-target dot stuff in phase 2, and then you're just going to be tunneling the boss and then his sword, which shares his health pool, just to phase him as fast as possible. And because of that, I'm just almost using my cooldowns basically on cooldown here, and only kind of saving them towards the end of the fight in phase 3 for that lineup. Now, that being said, if you do that, depending on your fight timings, you could screw yourself over. Make sure you coordinate with your group on, when you're actually going to be lusting. A lot of people are just lusting as soon as you get into phase 3 to phase as soon as possible and finish the fight. If you're doing that, you want to make sure you keep an eye on the boss's health pool so that you're not using Void Eruption right before he phases, and then you don't have Void Form for the actual lust burn. That's not good. But maybe it still makes sense if you need that extra Void Form to push the boss or help push the boss. So again, something you want to coordinate with your group about where and when you want your damage to go here based on your group's actual raid damage. And guys, that's the big part of this fight. I'm sure my opinions will change a little bit once I get to this fight on Mythic, but this is all that I really have to say for now with just, looking at the fight in Mythic and just killing it a few times on Heroic. So I hope this, guys, has helped you guys out. Alright guys, thank you so much for watching this Castle Nathria video. I know it's been a long one, but you can always come back and check out the timestamps that I have to easily skip to bosses you want a bit more tips on. And again, big shout out to the Icy Veins guide that I wrote that has a bit more detail on each one of these things that I've gone over here. If you do have specific questions, let me know. It is my plan at some point to upload specific kills with commentary, especially for the bosses like Sludgefist where things get a little bit more complicated. So if there are any bosses that you specifically think that you're struggling with and would like that video on, let me know in the comments below and we'll get that started as soon as I can. Big shout out to the patrons that are supporting me, guys. This guide would not be possible without their awesome support. Thank you so much to those guys, and thank you so much for watching. We'll see you in the next one.